Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration, historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups.
Whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality.
And having a parent that's in prison, you don't have your mom supporting you through life, or you don't have your dad encouraging you in ways that are necessary to develop. They're also wearing the burdens of their parents' crime. They didn't commit a crime.
Younger siblings and cousins or peers, people who witness it from very close hand, take note. By the time you are of age to really think about that experimentation, you've already seen negative consequences.
This is crack cocaine. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones.
It was Nixon who formally declared a war on drugs in 1971. And this is where federal spending on drug enforcement begins to really transform into the monster it is today. But even under Nixon's new war on drugs, there was still at least some emphasis on drug treatment and rehabilitation. For the origins of the militarized dystopian war on drugs we know and love in 2020, we have to wait for the 1980s and the racist hysteria that surrounded crack cocaine. Crack wasn't actually a new drug at all. It's simply cocaine that's been treated so you can smoke it instead of snort it. But the way it was treated by the authorities and the media was entirely different.
The police were busy going out into black communities and sweeping up black people for small amounts of crack cocaine and locking them up.
Before 1986, the average federal sentence for African Americans was already 11% higher than for white criminals. After 4 years of crack hysteria, it had rocketed to 49%. This is where the war on drugs really starts to look like a war. Police began to look like soldiers, and American money started to flood into military-style drug enforcement operations around the world. It was also this era of the drug war that saw America begin its mania for mass incarceration.
The heroin epidemic was petering out. We brought in these laws. There's something very sad about that, in that we set in motion this whole system for over a generation that perhaps was not necessary.
The prison population of the United States was flat in most of the 20th century. The last 50 years is this era shaped by a commitment to mass incarceration and excessive punishment. Prison population goes from 300,000 to 2.3 million, and this has really redefined the kind of country we are, the kind of place we inhabit. I think the greatest tragedy of the era of mass incarceration has been its impact on people of color.
America has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. And there are very clear racial disparities in this. The Bureau of Justice estimates that if you're a white male in the US, there's a 1 in 17 chance you'll go to jail or prison at some point in your lifetime. For Hispanic males, it's 1 in 6. For African Americans, 1 in 3.
So mass incarceration refers to the way the U.S. has locked up a vast population in federal and state prisons as well as local jails. So it seems like the factors like race and socioeconomic disparities contribute to mass incarceration and recidivism rates. Mass incarceration has raised significant social justice issues, especially since it has been heavily concentrated on the poor, uneducated African American, and brown population. The criminal justice shifted toward being more like a punisher instead of the rehabilitator. So recidivism rates in the United States are high because these affect the socioeconomic disparities, as I said before. So like labor and wages, neighborhoods and education, there are a big difference. So they have a significant impact on predicting the incarceration and recidivism.
This state, I've been on parole for 3 years. Well, actually 2.5 years right now, almost, I've been on parole. Went to the board for 2 early releases and got denied. I have no violations on the 2.5 years of parole. In that 2.5 years, I've started my own business. I went from renting a room to having my own 2-bedroom apartment. My bills are paid, my rent's paid. I always have an address, and parole comes to my house and never finds nothing. A lot of you taxpayers out there complain about high taxes, and not even just in New York State, in a lot of states. And do you know where a lot of your tax money goes? Into these prison systems. Because it's a business to these states. It employs millions and millions of people. Now, they take non-violent people and lock them away when they should be going to get drug treatment programs or psychiatric programs. You know, back in the 80s and the 70s, if you committed a murder and you pleaded insanity and you proved your insanity, you did your bid in a psych ward. But now they closed all these places down, and you know, people like me who was an addict, you know, I got locked up in prison for that, for being a drug addict. And in New York State prison, I got absolutely no drug treatment at all, no help at all from them. Live currently now in upstate New York. And to every county, there's 2 parole officers, and their caseloads are so big that they look to violate you on every little thing just so they don't have to deal with you.
The school-to-prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero-tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine, but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools, but although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the US were black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates, but black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination. Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested. So the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort.
"95% of all incarcerated people will return home at some point. Each year, more than 600,000 people are released from jails and prisons. That's roughly the population of Boston or Seattle. Millions more are completing non-jail sentences like probation, community service, or fines. Even for low-level offenses and misdemeanors, the aftermath of one individual's experience with the criminal justice system ripples out to entire families and neighborhoods and gets passed down from generation to generation. The result, more poverty, more crime, more incarceration. I see Javon, an 18-year-old young man who cannot live with or even visit his family and cannot find an affordable apartment because he was convicted of gun possession and banned from all public housing. I see the dangerous shelters and street corners where he'll sleep. I worry about what he's going to have to do to survive, how long it'll be before he's back behind bars. I see how society loses when Judy, a 58-year-old grandmother charged with a misdemeanor, is fired after her arrest and barred from her lifelong profession as a home health aide. Unable to work, she's faced with eviction and can't support her family. When Malik, a 26-year-old father, is denied the opportunity to further his education because of the mistakes of his past, I think about how he and so many others are set up to fail. How a conviction on a rap sheet is only a snapshot of a moment in time, when all of us are dynamic, changing over time. The criminal justice system disenfranchises these men and women, preventing them from growing, from truly being free.
In the past year, inmates have been put to work manufacturing hand sanitizer and PPE, washing hospital laundry, and digging mass graves for COVID victims. In normal years, they provide forced labor for thousands of U.S. corporations, including big names like McDonald's, Wendy's, Tyson, Verizon, Sprint, Fidelity, Walmart, JCPenney, and IBM. Angry yet? It still gets worse. With each passing year, America finds new ways to extract profits from human life. Let's talk about private prisons. As the war on drugs ramped up in the 1980s, federal prisons began to become overcrowded. The solution? Turn to the private sector to build new prisons for all this excess human inventory. The government contracts a private company to build the prisons, that company locks up the overflow prisoners, and in exchange they receive a fixed rate for each inmate. They are paid for each person they imprison. See the problem here? The prison slave labor market is a financial incentive not to pursue prison reform. It would damage the profits of thousands of US companies. But by adding for-profit prisons into the mix, cutting out the middleman, and simply making money off of human storage units, we've ensured that no meaningful reform will ever pass, at least not without a mass movement to demand it. Think about it. Who profits from the existence of private prisons? Private companies are given multi-hundred-million-dollar contracts, then their executives turn around and donate huge sums of that same money to politicians who will support private prisons. It's a never-ending cycle. Corrupt politicians are making money, private prisons are making money, and thousands of US companies are making money from literal slave labor. It makes perfect sense within the US capitalist framework.
As state-funded psychiatric facilities closed, the number of people in need of long-term care essentially shifted into the prison system. This was in part because many of these newly released patients became homeless and could be picked up for things like squatting or committing petty crimes in order to survive. When patients suffering from mental health issues are brought into emergency rooms, where they can usually only remain for around 72 hours, there isn't a consistent bridge between emergency care and long-term care, especially because the country as a whole has a limited number of beds in safe psychiatric facilities. And by some counts, there are approximately twice as many people suffering from mental illness in US prisons than there are in US psychiatric hospitals. Even though many medical experts agree there is no positive correlation between mental health and committing violent crimes. So private prisons were looked to as a way of cutting the cost of increased incarceration that occurred as a result of major policy shifts. But it's unclear if private prisons actually serve their intended purpose, to save the government money. However, they do make up a relatively small percentage of the overall number of prisons in the country. In 2016, privately owned prisons only accounted for about 8.5% of the total prison population, according to the Sentencing Project. Today, we see a return to conversations and debates about the two primary roles of prisons and jails, their ideologies, and how those ideologies align with their responsibilities to the incarcerated. As reports of widespread abuses at public jails like Rikers Island in New York have hit the headlines in the early 2010s, we turn again to why a country with a relatively small percentage of the world's population claims such a large percentage of its incarcerated population.
That needed my medication, my psych. When I first met with them, they told me straight out, blank, that they were not going to give me my medication for my voices, which is Seroquel.
It wasn't that they didn't believe that he was prescribed this. They just disagreed with the dosage and therefore refused to give it to him.
The voices were coming back a lot stronger. The more I fight that it's a hallucination, it's not real, the more reality they become. It took them at least 5 days to give me my medication that I needed for the voices.
Another serious concern that we have about the treatment of inmates with mental illness in jails is the overuse of segregation. We're seeing a lot of inmates with serious mental health conditions being confined in their cell by themselves for up to 23 hours a day. Often losing their hour out, so being confined for 24 hours a day.
It was really hard. It was, to be in your room all day, not being able to have, privileges, and et cetera, knowing that other people in the facility are having those privileges, like, going to church, going outside, or going to NA meetings, I, have bipolar, depression. Being locked down in your cell, for 23 hours a day is, hard, It caused me, to be emotional and stuff.
I just ask people that don't hallucinate, that don't do that, just to think themselves about being in a room 23 hours a day. Like your fantasy is a real world. Like a production of a movie, how real it looks, real. But in this case, it's not a movie. It's a reality of my life that I have to deal with.
One of the problems that we see pretty frequently is that there isn't significant or even sort of minimal planning, release planning for inmates who have mental illness. What does that mean? That means making appointments for them with outside providers, connecting them to maybe resources and services that they already had in place, working with their friends and family, ensuring that they have someplace to live, ensuring that they are at least minimally covered by medical insurance, ensuring that they have medication when they leave the jail, psychiatric medication that will bridge that gap until they can get to an outside provider, things like that.
The situation became so dire that in April, a federal judge ordered an emergency overhaul of the jail's health measures. Sakithia Staley's partner, William Cox, is being held in the D.C. jail on a weapons possessions charge.
People have corona, instead of them, sending people home or, sending people to the doctors, all they do is quarantine them in the cell for for a long period of time. And that's not safe because the cells are dirty. People have died from it in the same units, in the same floors that he's on. He feel like that it's easy for him to get it.
Right now, more than 2 million Americans are sitting behind bars as the coronavirus outbreak deepens. Many prison systems have ended in-person visiting for loved ones. Inmates say there's little they can do to avoid catching the virus.
It's not really built for 6 feet distance because it's too compact. When they let us out to eat dinner, we still have to stand in line to get our food, and there's no way we can keep the 6 feet. If you have symptoms or anything, it's like they punish you because they put you in a hole to quarantine you away from everybody. So if a person is sick, they're going to try to get away from them because nobody wants to go to the hole. If something happens, there's nothing that they can do because it's too crowded in here.
So as we know, the minority population is greatly affected by the incarceration levels within this country. This is why it is important to implement nonprofits within urban communities that can ensure that these individuals have the resources and tools that they need to assimilate back into society. Formerly, I worked at a nonprofit called More Than Words in Boston, Massachusetts, and its main purpose was to help youth and adults take charge of a business by taking charge of their lives. In this program, they were given tools and resources needed to deal with their traumas, as well as professionalism and job vocational training. Relating this back to New York State and Dutchess County, I believe that nonprofits such as More Than Words can be implemented up here to ensure that the youth and adults that have been greatly affected by the criminal justice system has a safe space to go to ensure that they can move forward and make sure that they have the proper training that they need to be the best individuals that they can be. I think that this is made possible through having connections with mayors and senates and governmental officials within the community so we can all be on the same page and work towards ensuring that these individuals have everything that they need.
%95 of these incarcerated men and women are returning to the community, with 68% returning back to prison in the first 3 years. There's a dichotomy here that we're struggling to fix. This is a country that's built on second chances, but it ends at the prison system. There's a huge amount of guilt with the men and women that have gone to prison. But through this college program that we've created, they're realizing that they can take their future and really make it very different than what they've seen in the past because education is giving them those tools. The students will talk about this education. They talk about it being a new lens and how that new lens gives them a way to look at the world in a different way that they've never known even existed.
I'm 4th generation
male incarcerated in my family. I took my gift for numbers to become a drug dealer. I took my gift of gab to negatively peer pressure other people into getting in the game with me. The education was very important because I didn't realize the connection between what I already knew, my natural talents, and success.
We want to work with a student that everyone else has given up on. This is an accredited degree-granting college program. Their degree does not say University of Sing Sing. It says Nyack College. It says Mercy College. It says Columbia University. I have seen the rippling effect of that one degree as it goes into their families, their children, their neighbors, their community. We are truly helping the community through this one person and this one degree.
Being able to provide individuals with opportunities to gain productive skills and strengthen positive relationships between themselves and others. If they are released from prison and this allows themselves to achieve their full potential and transform their lives. There's also something called prison programming. Prison programming has also been useful. While incarcerated, this will help provide a person who is incarcerated with crucial skills, knowledge, education, and improve their character development. Prison programming will increase future employments for individuals who are incarcerated and decrease rule violations. There are also weaknesses to the prison reform system. Prison is expensive, and this increases taxes on all. Those incarcerated in prison educate others in criminal matters. This often leads to those in prison to breed resentment and determination to get back at society. There are times when prison reform is not brought about. Other disadvantages of prison reform is prison records make it difficult to get a job on release, which can actually eventually lead back to some sort of crime.
Okay, so we understand, and we may even have compassion for the fact that people need a place to live. But we don't want them to live on our street, and we don't want them to live in our neighborhood. Right? We understand that people need jobs and that they need a source of income, but we don't want them working in our workplace. And we believe that people should be contributing to their communities, but we don't want them volunteering side by side with us. And in this way, we deny people the things that they need the most, right? They need a safe place to live. They need a job. They need connections to their community and healthy relationships. We exclude people from our communities. And while mental illness is not a predictor of violence, excluding people from communities is linked to violence. So conversely, including people in our communities contributes to mental health recovery and contributes to reducing the risk of people re-engaging in criminal behaviors. So what power do you have to include people in your community? Are you a landlord or a property manager? Is there a vacancy in your building? You have the power to give someone a place to live. Are you an employer? Are you hiring in your workplace right now? You have the power to give someone a job. Are you a volunteer in your community? You have the opportunity to provide a connection for someone who may not have any other social connections.